And while Cuba continues to be blockaded by the USA, a blockade of the superpower of this century, China, comes under scrutiny in the 60th film of John Pilger, which opens in cinemas next week. The coming war on China will be screened around the world here on RT. Award-winning journalist and filmmaker John Pilger joins me now. John, thanks for coming back on the show. Why should the world be focusing on President Obama's pivot to Asia and the issues you describe in this film?
Well, as you mentioned, it's a blockade, but this is probably the most dangerous blockade. There are 400 US bases encircling China. They start in Australia, they go through the Pacific, they go up through Japan, Korea, across Eurasia. It's like a giant noose around China. Missiles, warships, low-draft warships, which can approach China just outside Chinese waters. The provocation of China that has gone on in the last 5-6 years has been extreme, to the point where China itself has changed its nuclear weapons policy. It's gone from low alert to high alert. It's developed the kind of long-range missiles that will target the US Navy. I mean, it is extraordinary. It's not only a blockade, it's a blackout. Apart from you and I discussing it, and here and there in the media, but usually on the World Wide Web, the blackout of this situation around China has been almost total. You have the biggest build-up of US air and naval forces since the Second World War. That's an extraordinary story that has simply been suppressed.
Every single news report, I think I can say every single one in mainstream media, without exception, tells us that it's China that is pushing military aggression in the South China Sea.
Well,
so what you're talking about is merely a response.
I mean, in a way, the film is about the news, the perception that we're given, where we're not allowed to know these important and very disturbing events. We use, from the BBC, various news reports, the BBC, CNN, Fox and others near the beginning of the film, which are all about, as I think the BBC report says, China's ambitious plans to fortify the South China Sea, build airstrips in the South China Sea, and indeed it is building airstrips in the South China Sea. But another blackout has been on the biggest military exercise in living memory, and that was Operation Talisman Sabre, which the US last year, 2015, the US led, and in which they rehearsed the blockade of the Straits of Malacca, through which come 80% of China's oil, its resources, much of its trade, and so on. So this constant provocation is really what that rather innocuous term, pivot to Asia, that Obama announced in 2011 really means.
But, of course, it's not just Obama. Successive US administrations have been in that environment. Why, in your film, does the Marshall Islands, this group of islands in the Pacific, feature at the top of the film?
Well, I mean, what we're talking about here with this blockade of China is really a nuclear threat. We're back at the few minutes to midnight in terms of the possibility, the prospect of nuclear war, in which the Pentagon's Law of War manual now says it's okay, in effect, to use nuclear weapons. So we have the provocation of the newest major nuclear power.
And the Marshall Islands?
The Marshall Islands figure in this because the Marshall Islands is where the nuclear age began, where something like the equivalent of one Hiroshima every day was exploded in the Marshall Islands for 12 years. And today in the Marshall Islands, there's a major secretive US base on Kwajalein Atoll, which was set up with China as its target. And this base, in its surveillance, in its missile firing, commands the Pacific all the way to Asia and China. So it's a major part of the necklace of US bases.
Let's go to another element of the necklace, which is also in it. In just past few days, actually, people were marking 6 months since the arrest of a US military contractor in Okinawa for rape. What is the significance of Okinawa in this necklace?
Well, Okinawa has 132 US military installations. I haven't been anywhere quite like it. It's like the term aircraft carrier is often used, but this is. People who live there are permanently fenced in, and they're fenced in by US bases. There is a very active and very vibrant anti-bases movement, but from these bases, the US has attacked, well, goes right back. It's attacked Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, today Afghanistan, Iraq. But its significance now is that it's 400 miles from China, and all these bases are aimed at China.
But the Japanese government wants that base. So Japan says, the Japanese island.
Well, yes, Japan is not really an independent country in terms of foreign policy. And most of its bases in Japan, most American bases, are on the island of Okinawa. Japan has a very nationalist government under Shinzo Abe. It seems to want to, if it doesn't want to go to war with China, Abe and a lot of his ministers, his very nationalist ministers, are saying some very extraordinary things. There's a great deal of provocation there. The point about all of this, you know, is that I don't think anyone wants nuclear war or even a war between great powers like the US and China. But what is happening here is the laying of ground, a landscape of potential mistakes and accidents. And as a panel in the US said not long ago, led by General James Cartwright, he said that they worried that the decision to retaliate against a nuclear attack comes down to less than 12 minutes. So we're back to that almost a strange world which we worried about, or at least an earlier generation worried about, but we should be worrying about it again, because China is one front, that is in Asia. You know, there is in the northern hemisphere, there is, in effect, a kind of encirclement of Russia. On the western borders of Russia, there is US NATO troops are pressing. So these two fronts are probably, I would think, the most urgent issues. They are the most urgent issues in the world today because they represent the whole precarious state of relations between great powers. And with a change of president in the United States, it could go either way. I'm not sure which way it'll go, but it's a very fragile period.
You illuminate so many issues, so we can't talk about all of them. You do go through the fact that it didn't even need to be this way. Mao in 1949 made overtures to the United States. But just one quick mention on drugs, because there is an allegation in this film about the ancestry of the current US Secretary of State.
Well, it's not really an allegation. They're all historical facts, actually. No one really mentions them. As James Bradley, the author of The China Mirage, tells us in the film that he researched for instance, the father of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was basically a drug runner. The Americans of that generation, John Kerry's grandfather, was a drug runner in China. So when the Opium Wars were going on, led by Britain, but right at Britain's elbow was the United States. Everyone was making a fortune out of opium from China. And that was really China's significance in the 19th century, early 20th century, as a subjugated colonial nation was drugs. As Bradley says, you know, the great railroads in the United States were built on drugs. The first industrial city, Lowell, Massachusetts, was built on drugs money. Now, what's interesting and very significant is that China, whilst having that history almost as a presence in China today, you feel it, people will talk about it, but has put it to one side to embrace a modernity that is quite astonishing, and they've done it in such a short time. Now that, to the United States, is a threat, because it's not a military threat. I don't think really anybody who knows China suggests that it's a rapacious superpower that wants to take over the world by military means.
It's a threat to the American dream.
Well, it's wrecking the top dog who's feeling insecure.
Okay, well, just briefly now, all your films are about resistance in the end. They are, to say it is an optimistic film, even though you just mentioned 12 minutes. At any point, we seem to be near the end of humanity. How fearless are the activists now who are in this film in the face of US military power? Because these activists are trying to stop the domination of their islands' peoples.
Well, I think they're fearless and I think they're courageous because, you know, the film really reflects their spirit, I hope. It's a warning. And yes, as you point out, it's a dire warning that we should heed. But the people telling us, alerting us to this danger are themselves every day demonstrating this extraordinary courage. On the island of Okinawa alone, without any support apart from individual support from around the world, they've stood up to the greatest military power on earth, and as a result have got themselves the first actually anti-US policy governor in Japan's post-war history. So they've succeeded up to a point. The same thing has happened on tiny Jeju Island, off the southern tip of Korea, where every day for the last decade, a group of people led by these Catholic priests stage 4 or 5 masses at the gates of this US base that has been, or sorry, South Korean base that has been purpose-built for US nuclear submarines and destroyers. They stage a mass there to try and stop it. And it's all done with such dignity and in silence. It's an inspiring spectacle. These people standing up to what could be a coming war ought to be an inspiration for the rest of us.
John Pilger, thank you.
Thank you.